Hello everyone and welcome to my demo. We'll get started here in just a second. Alright, well, I'll start off with the very beginning. This is the drawing. I'm using a small rigger and some burnt umber acrylic. I'm actually using acrylic paint to do this drawing because I wanted to get it done quickly and get the painting started the next day. So I just opted to use acrylic for the drawing here. Got the general size and shape of the apple established here, and I'm just starting to fill it out. Normally, when I'm doing something like this, I might just use a template, or I might use a grid or something, but with this one I just felt like going for it without a template of any kind. I just have the reference photo off to the side, and I'm using that, establishing where the leaf is. There are many different ways you can approach the drawing aspect of this. Normally I do it in oil, but as I said, I wanted to get the painting started the next day, and unless I had used liquid, I probably would not have been able to do that. But I don't like liquid. I would much rather just draw this in quickly with the acrylic. I don't know, makes it more immediate that way. I only had a limited time to get stuff in here before it started drying, so in a way that keeps me from fussing too much, right? Like if I had used oil paint with liquid or Galkid or something, I probably would have been a little bit more fussy and it might have taken me longer. Who knows? I felt like using the acrylic would be a good way of just not overthinking things and going for it and just being more or less final with everything I put down. Getting into the paint that I'm going to use here, I just have ivory black and titanium white, and a couple piles of titanium white that I'm going to use to mix the various shades of gray that I'm going to block in the painting with. This is usually what I do. I usually start by mixing up some paint before I start. When I'm blocking, maybe I'll take, I don't know, 2 or 3 different piles of paint for every section, like the background, the subject. Maybe there's 2 different objects in the painting. I'll have a separate set of gray tones for each one of those. If I'm doing a grisaille, that is. If I'm working in color, I do the same thing. I just have different color families. And I lay them out pretty much just like this, in order from dark to light, left to right. And I wait until I've got a pretty good understanding of where I'm going with the paint, with the tones and or colors before I head to the canvas. Five tones is pretty good for a block in of an apple. It's pretty simple. I'm not looking for anything crazy. As you could see there, I had the 5 tones mixed up, and the one I'm using now is the one furthest to the left that isn't actually black, but it is a very dark gray, and I'm using it to begin to lay in the shadows of the apple. on the underside here. I don't always start with the darks, but in this particular case, I felt like it made sense, especially considering that this is a demo. It's definitely not a bad way to go. Moving up into I'm still in the shadows, but it's a lighter gray than the one I was using underneath there. Just basically filling in space. There's no rhyme or reason to the way I'm working. It's just more or less intuitive sense of where I need to put those tones. Just go by sight. I think it's important in the beginning, especially for your block end, to be somewhat spontaneous, because you know you're going to be critical and analytical later. But being spontaneous like this just lets you get in there and feel it out. And get a sense of where everything is supposed to be. And do your best to eyeball it, get it right. You know, you're not always going to get it right. You might find that you get it totally wrong, but anything is better than a blank canvas. Any application of paint here is further along in the process than when I started. Now I'm getting onto the highlight areas. Basically just working my way from left to right across those pre-mixed tones that I have on my palette. I'm jumping ahead with the video here just to give you the basics of what I'm doing. It did take me quite a while to paint this whole thing. I don't recall exactly how long it took me, but it was a solid maybe hour or two to do the block in, the entire block in. I wanted to make sure that I keep this demo within a half an hour. I think it went a little bit over, but the goal of half an hour was what I started out with when I began editing all this video. So you have to make some cuts somewhere if you're going to do that. But I've kept in most of the good stuff. So I've switched brushes. I don't know if there's a rule saying that you have to switch brushes when you get to, I could have done the whole block in with one brush and that would have been fine. But there are times, and I'm sure you can tell by now that there are times when I just can't help myself and I have to put in some sort of detail, even if it's minimal, but just so I can, I don't know, I guess think of it in terms of taking notes. Doing what I'm doing right here is sort of like a placeholder, keeping me in line with my thought process as I move on. When I get to that spot later on, I'll know, what I had in mind before, which was to convey a sense of roundness, even with a block-in like this. I guess you could consider this more of an advanced block-in. But like I said, sometimes I can't help myself, and it happens. I would say that a block-in does not need to be this fussy. You can be very quick and very deliberate with a block-in and just put stuff in there and then go back later and adjust it. But I like to have a pretty good sense of where I'm going, and I tend to put in just enough detail to help myself later on when I come back. That's just the way I do it. The blocking of the apple here is almost done, and I'll be moving on to the background. That's another thing I did out of order. Usually, usually I'll do the background first, but for some reason I don't know, maybe I was hungry and the apple happened first this time. But it doesn't matter. You just sort of go with it and do whatever makes sense at the time, and when I did this, it made sense to do the apple first. I'm always looking for ways to remind myself of what I'm doing, kind of like a journal. Little touches I'll put here and there to remind myself later when I get back what my thought process was at the time. All this stuff I'm doing right now, this is unnecessary for a block-in, but I just do it because it helps me later on. When I'm working on an area like that, I might think to myself, oh, I want to make this, I want to make sure that I convey this this highlight here, or I want to make sure that this translates in a certain way. Whatever it is that I'm thinking, I'll go ahead and I'll do something. I'll put in a little detail or a little blend of some color with another, just to remind myself later. And when I get back to it, I'll think, oh, yeah, that's right. That's what I was thinking. Maybe I'll agree with myself and maybe I won't. That's all part of the process. So now I've started on the background, and this is basically just the same process of checking the photograph and making sure that I'm not totally out of line. I will occasionally reference the photograph directly, making sure that the tone that I have is the same. But with the block-in, I'm mostly just winging it and making decisions based on what I feel. I'm a lot more critical and technical when I get to the next layer. When I'm putting in the modeling, I will actually spend a lot of time initially checking my values up against the photograph and making sure that they're accurate before I paint. Okay, so we're just filling in some more of the background here. Moving on to the left side eventually. I'm being relatively careful around the edges of the apple. I don't want to ruin the shape that I have because I rather like it. But also at the same time, you have to be aware that if you do mess it up a little bit, that, you can always fix it. It's never a done deal. It can always be fixed. So I'm careful, but I'm not overly careful. And now getting to the table. At this point, I remember not being too conscious of how I wanted the table to look in the end. The photograph doesn't really have that much detail. I mean, it has some, but I didn't want to take too much focus away from the apple, so I wasn't too particular about rendering any specific, like wood grain details or anything like that later on. So my thinking here is just to get the shadows in that are on the table, the shadow being cast by the apple, and then that dark line that I'm painting in there now, they're on the left. And then I decided to take a little bit of artistic license because the bottom of the frame there isn't quite that dark, but I just darkened it to pull attention up toward the center a little bit, where it belongs. I'm just adding some final details to the apple there before I let it dry. And this painting will, this layer will dry for approximately 1 to 2 weeks before I work on it again. So here we are. This is a week and a half later, and the painting is dry to the touch, and I've got my tones laid out, ready to go. You can see I have more of them this time, and I'm soaking some oil into the tip of a cosmetic sponge that I put out there on my palette with a brush. What I'm going to do is oil out the surface so that I can continue to paint. I'm just tapping the oil onto the surface of the canvas with the corner of that sponge, which has absorbed just enough oil to deposit there and be sufficient for the task of oiling out. You don't need any more than this. This is all you need. Just enough to moisten the surface and get it to shine, get it wet, and ready to accept the next layer of paint. So here I'm just setting about putting in some detail. I keep saying detail, but what I mean is I'm taking that initial painting that I have and I'm refining it. I'm developing it. I'm giving it more three-dimensional form. I'm describing more of what I see on the surface without getting into any detail, as in the texture of the apple's surface. The surface of the apple has a lot of little specks, little dots, and all sorts of light and dark patterns running across the surface, and that's not what I'm after right here. All I want to do here is describe the fact that the apple is round. So whatever I have to do to get the roundness of the apple to translate is what I'm focused on doing here. That's the goal of this step, this stage of the painting. So the brush changes from that larger number 2 filbert to these small sable brushes. This one is Hamburg Premier from Jerry's Artarama. This is a size 0, I think, or a 1. This is a dagger from Rosemary Company. I just decided to use it because I had it on hand, plus it makes this wonderful edge, just like that, there on the, if you use the edge of it. So you can use the tip of it in similar fashion as you would a round, but it also has that great edge for making really sharp lines. Now here I've decided that the bottom left side of the apple wasn't far enough out, so I'm giving it a little bit more weight over on that side by extending the edge over to the left. And now I'm setting about the task of really getting in there and studying the highlight and getting it to translate the way it does in the photograph. The values were a bit too dark in my block-in, so I'm taking the opportunity now to lighten those up. And here I am allowing myself to be a little bit more descriptive in the work that I'm doing. It's not generalized, forms, masses of tone anymore. It's about really getting in there and describing how round that apple is, because if I don't get that right, then the apple won't read as three-dimensional. It'll just read as flat, or it'll read with incorrect topology, right? Like if I don't put the highlights in just the right place, if I don't get the values just right, it might look like the apple has a dimple or a recessed area where it really doesn't have that. So all of these things are very important to describe accurately. As I alluded to before, I referenced the photograph quite a bit to make sure that the values I have are correct. I make sure that whatever value I have on my brush goes where it needs to go. And I don't tend to just paint arbitrarily and say, oh, well, I'll just blend that away. I typically try to put the correct value down in the correct space. And in certain cases, I even follow the form like I'm doing, well, like I was doing on that upper right area there before this. But here, it's just bringing that highlight up to the correct value. Now I feel like I've gone far enough into that modeling that I can actually start to add some of the surface detail. Most of the time I do 3 layers of paint. With this apple I only did 2. And I suppose you could say that I knew I was only going to do 2 because my block-in was a little bit more developed than a standard block-in, but I had this in mind of only doing 2 layers. If I had wanted to separate this into 3 layers, I would have stopped painting after modeling the form and let that completely dry before I went in and added these little specks. But I'm just adding them over the wet paint. There isn't really a problem, at least I didn't discover that I was having an issue putting those specks in there, so I just went with it. If I had noticed that I was blending too much and that they weren't looking the way I wanted them to look, I probably would have stopped. So here I've adjusted the camera a little bit, and I have to point out that the reason I've adjusted the camera is because my camera battery died. My camera battery died, and well, it was starting to expand, and I decided to throw it away before it exploded on me. So this footage was actually shot with my phone, and it is somewhat obvious that we've lost a little bit of quality here. The major issue I was having was that the color, the white balance, would not stay calibrated, and it kept shifting around as the light in the room changed. You know, some clouds would go by, or then the sun would come out, and the time of day, it was getting on in the afternoon, so the color of the light changed outside, and over the course of shooting this, the gray tones went from blue to orange, and I felt like it was a little bit too distracting, so I just went ahead and desaturated the footage from here on out. So we're officially watching a black and white video of a black and white painting now. But I'm really getting in there and describing this leaf. I'm using the smaller round brush from the, let's see, what is that? That's the Hamburg. You can get those from Jerry's. But this is, I mean, for me, it's just about getting the form and the detail as far along as possible before I really don't feel like I'm doing any good anymore, right? Like I feel like as soon as I reach a point where I can't figure out what to do to improve what I'm working on, then I usually stop. That's my indication that I'm done. Obviously, we haven't reached that point yet, but that's how I think about it. Those highlights on the left side of it really make the leaf pop. I mean, you can just keep going. As long as you feel like you're improving the image, then keep going. See, I've figured out that there isn't really much more I can do there, so I've moved over to the apple to get the light on this side of it to look right now. I definitely felt like the rim of the apple was not light enough, and in making that brighter, I noticed that the rest of it needed to be brighter. So I just went back and essentially did some more modeling here on top of my little speck detail. A little bit more of that rim coming through there. Yeah, it's all about the, describing the form. It wasn't feeling round enough to me. Now here I'm trying to make sure I get that shadow to look right. It has to have the bottom of it has to be softer than the top because the leaf is further away from the surface there, and it's a pretty big light. The surface area of the light is pretty big, so it's going to make that softened shadow. Now here, it's basically just a matter of getting in there and getting those values right. And I'm using this opportunity to draw in a little bit of surface texture here. Keep in mind that the surface of the canvas is wet. So even though I'm putting paint directly onto it, I am painting wet into wet because the oil from the oiling out process that I did is still there and still wet. Now I felt like the apple was looking pretty good there, so I went ahead and moved on to refine the table, which wasn't bright enough in my block-in. So here I'm just getting that value up to where it should be on both sides. Now I'm right-handed, so getting in along the left edge of that apple was pretty difficult. It took me a pretty long time, so I just went ahead and edited that out. Otherwise we'd be sitting here watching me trying to figure out how to hold the brush. It was pretty tricky because I wasn't using a maul stick. Now, having gotten the values in the table correct, I can see that there's more I wanted to do to the apple, and it's a back and forth. It's kind of like a dance like that. You adjust something, and then something about the rest of it doesn't look right. So you adjust that one thing, and then you fix the rest, and it's just a back and forth play until you get to a point where you really don't feel like changing one thing makes something else look like it needs more work. You just keep going and keep going and keep going until you get to that point. Now here, I feel like I've covered up some of those little specks. So in a minute, you're going to see me go back through and put those little surface textures back in. But first, darkening the corners. I feel like that was a good choice. Back to the edge. And I'm jumping around, and the reason I do that is so that I don't get stuck in one place too long and end up giving the impression that it's stale. By jumping around and working the entire image as a whole, you tend to get a more cohesive image as a finished product. Now here we go, back into the dots again. Again, this is final surface texture. I feel like everything else is working, and it's just a matter of getting these little dots in here. One last little touch to the ground there, the tabletop. And I believe we're ready to call this one finished. And there you go. From the proper angle this time. Thanks for watching.